It is exactly 8 minutes after 4 p.m. Central African time. Now, as the World Government Summit, the WGS 2026, wraps up in Dubai, African leaders and financial experts are intensifying calls for the continent to shift away from aid. We do know that this has been the key financial resource for African governments for decades. But this aid dependence is now coming to an end. And the call is for African governments to prioritize investment-led growth. Speaking during a panel discussion titled Government and the Future of Investment, an African Perspective, how the continent can unlock private capital at a pivotal moment in its economic transformation, Dr. Akinwumi Adesina, the 8th president of the African Development Bank Group, says Africa stands at a defining crossroads. For more on this, we joined on the line by Dr. Akinwumi Adesina, the former president of the African Development. A very good afternoon to you, Doctor. Welcome to Africa in Business.
Thank you very much, Thami. How are you?
I'm very well, thank you. Quite a pivotal moment and some very timely discussions and debates being held at the World Government Summit. Now, you mentioned there and emphasized that Africa needs investment rather than aid. And we can all see that that era of aid is fast coming to an end. Why is this shift so critical for the long-term growth as well as the transformation of African economies, Doctor?
Well, first and foremost, I don't think aid is the way to grow anyway. You know, it's like you're holding a walking stick and eventually you keep cutting it, you're going to fall over. So that's one thing to keep in mind. You know, when you actually develop with your own strategy, you are in control of that strategy. You are also going to be able to control your priorities. You'll be able to also build yourself in a more resilient manner. And of course, you're going to be able to actually attract private capital. Look, private capital is the way to grow. And so I believe that the key for Africa is to move away from aid into investment-led growth. And we have quite a lot of things to do for that. Take a look at the GDP growth for Africa. Real GDP growth of Africa by IMF shows that Africa is the fastest growing region in the world, period, of all regions of the world. But not only that, Thami, for the first time ever, Africa is actually going to be growing for the next 4 years consecutively, being the fastest growing region in the world. And Africa is delivering a significant amount of value. If you look at all that's been done in terms of investment in Africa, in returns on infrastructure, return on real asset investments, they have yielded more than low to mid-teens of returns in the last 10 years alone. So that tells you that Africa is investable, and that's what I want us focusing on, Africa as an investment-driven destination. Yes.
So, Doctor, it looks like the environment is opportune and is at its peak for the continent to benefit from this. But what are the biggest obstacles that African economies face in attracting this long-term investment? And I'm speaking particularly around issues of policy certainty as well as the structural reforms that need to be taking place. Should governments be doing more to prioritize an investment-friendly environment over and above the GDP forecasts?
Absolutely. There's no doubt about it. Capital, to welcome capital, you have to make sure that you get your house in order. One of the key things is that you got to also make sure that the policy reforms are the right policy reforms. Look, investors don't like, they're not looking for a situation where it is a perfection. They are just looking for predictability. That predictability requires that you do a number of things. First and foremost, that your policy environment requires that you can't just change policies overnight. So that's one thing that's very important. The macroeconomic environment is very important. How you manage your inflation, your debt and currency volatility is very, very critical. You also have to make sure that people can have arbitration. They have to be able to have rule of law and those things that actually bring transparency. In addition, most companies that want to come to Africa, the challenge is sometimes it takes a long time to get a business registered. So when you have actually digital systems that people can register on their digital platform to invest, yes, they can also register on land registries. They can also register to make sure they have their permits. All those things are good. And finally, of course, is reforms around your taxes and also the customs reforms. The tax regime have to be one that is actually quite simple for people to do. And you also have to make sure that you don't have, retroactive taxes that people have already invested and you change the rule of the game while it is on. That's always a no-no for investors. Investors are not scared of actually losing money. They are more scared about not being able to get their money out. So at the end of the day, you've got to also be able to make sure that they can get their capital out, but in terms of their profit and their capital. Yes. So the heads of state that we are working with within the Global Africa Investment Summit are all committed to all these critical reforms that will make sure that capital can not only come to Africa, stay in Africa, but grow in Africa.
You've really mentioned the key fundamentals of what investors need. Let's take a look at African financial institutions, including the African Development Bank itself. Have these institutions done enough to mobilize both local and international investment?
Yeah, well, I used to be, I was president of African Development Bank for 10 years. I think multilateral development banks are doing a great job. The African Development Bank, we did a great job. And I've got a new person taking over me, and he will do a great job. But the things that the multilateral development banks have to continue to do is that they have, concessional finance. So blended finance is very important to reduce the weighted cost of capital that the private sector is going to need. There's no doubt there are risks that we still have to look at. So private, partial credit guarantees and partial risk guarantees are going to be critical to have that. You will have a number of projects that are great projects, but you need to also de-risk them. And so for that, you also need to make sure that viability gap issues are done. And so these multilateral development banks can help with government to close some of these viability gaps. And of course, you have political risk, which is also important. They have political risk insurance that they can use. So in any case, we are still going to work quite a lot with them to make sure that's been done. I think that the multilateral development banks and other financial institutions, by their risk products, are going to be important, especially, in most of the African countries, a lot of the investments have to also be in local currency. So having local currency hedging instruments are also going to be important. And so there's a role for everybody.
So let's look, Doctor, at the perhaps lowest hanging fruit, the strongest opportunities for foreign investments to act as a catalyst for growth. Which other sectors would you highlight that offer the greatest potential for a truly transformative in investment landscape?
First and foremost, you got to get the energy right. So the energy sector is going to be very, very important, for Africa. Agriculture, of course, 65% of the uncultivated arable land left in the world to feed 9.5 billion people. It's not in Asia, it's not in Latin America, it's not in Europe, it's not in America, it's in Africa. So that is going to be a very, very critical sector. But also the minerals and metals and critical minerals and metals and rare earth is big. Look, Africa, Thami, has $6 trillion of reserves of these critical minerals and rare earth. And this is where we are going to get the most value from. But the key is we are not going to be just selling those raw materials, again, like we've always been doing. That's the door to poverty. All we've got to do is to structure it properly that Africa is going to be able to engage. Look, lithium, cobalt, platinum, the value is going to rise by 3 times in the next few years. And so what Africa has to do, what we are going to help them to do through the Global Africa Investment Summit, is to structure a lot of their assets and structure in such a way that those assets can be the risk investable grade portfolio into which global investors can actually invest. But there's no doubt in my mind that those assets are there. What's often very much missing is how to systematically de-risk those assets and to make sure that people can know what the assets are, what are their values, and how are you going to structure them in a way that makes them attractive for global investors. So yes, the opportunities are there, but we've got to structure it properly. And I think our platform is the right way to do it transparently in a way that gives confidence to global investors.
Dr. Adesina, I'm sure you'll agree with me that ultimately the main aim is for Africa as a continent to be self-reliant. As we move away from aid, is there a risk that increased foreign investment could in fact replace one form of dependency with another? How can the continent safeguard against that?
Now, you got a good point there, but the thing is, I think we've got to not be afraid of capital, right? Capital grows everywhere in the world, and I think that the key is by going with private capital, first and foremost, you are able to attract significant amount of foreign investment into the countries that we are talking about. Secondly, those countries can develop without having to need aid. Third is that when you have the discipline of private capital, you have to be more transparent, okay, in how things are done. So back to your point in terms of improving the policy environment, I think you are going to make sure that that gets done. But in everything that we do, we have to make sure, and we will make sure, that those assets are not assets that they give away. Africa doesn't have to give away any asset. It just simply has to monetize the returns for those assets while controlling those assets by itself. And this is exactly what we are going to help it to do. And so I feel, in my view, that the roles of our communities are very, very important. Our local content is very, very critical, and making sure that ESG, environmental, social governance issues, are very well done. So there's no fear here about Africa having private sector taking over things. No. Each of these countries will have the right parameters in which they are going to engage. The key is unlock the assets for African communities, for Africans themselves, and create jobs for a lot of the young people in Africa. So the safeguards are in place to ensure that this works for Africa, but not simply working for somebody else.
Dr. Adesina, always a pleasure speaking with you. Thank you very much for your insight and your time as the World Government Summit wraps up in Dubai. Thank you, sir.
Thank you very much, Thami.
Thank you. That's Dr. Akinwumi Adesina. He is the former president of the African Development Bank.